I've always believed that success tastes different when you've had to fight for every single bite. And let me tell you, sitting in that Chicago boardroom on a gray October morning in 2018, watching the senior partners announce my promotion, the taste was bittersweet as hell. My name is Nora Adams. I'm 31 years old, and I'd just been named senior partner at Morrison Associates, one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the Midwest. "Congratulations, Nora," Richard Morrison said, his weathered hands clasping mine across the mahogany conference table. "Your dedication to the Millennium Tower project and your innovative approach to sustainable design have impressed us all. You've earned this." The other partners nodded approvingly, but all I could think about was how different this moment felt from what I'd imagined. There was no champagne, no celebration, just a quiet acknowledgment of years of 16-hour days, missed dinners, and sacrificed weekends. I thanked them professionally, shook hands, and walked back to my office with the strange hollowness that comes when you realize achieving your dreams doesn't automatically heal old wounds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Chen, my closest friend and fellow architect, was waiting by my desk with 2 cups of coffee and that knowing smile he'd perfected over the 3 years we worked together. "So," he asked, though he could read the answer on my face. "Senior partner," I said, effective immediately. "Jesus, Nora, that's incredible." He set down his coffee and pulled me into a hug that smelled like expensive cologne and drafting paper. "Do you know how huge this is? You're the youngest senior partner they've ever had." I should have been ecstatic. I should have been calling everyone I knew, posting on social media, planning a celebration dinner. Instead, I found myself staring out my 20th floor window at the Chicago skyline, remembering another moment of achievement that had been overshadowed by my sister Clara's effortless charm. It was senior year of high school, 2005. I'd just been named valedictorian, the culmination of 4 years of perfect attendance, extra credit projects, and nights spent studying while other kids went to parties. My parents, Harold and June Adams, had taken Clara and I to dinner at Giuseppe's, our family's go-to restaurant for special occasions. "We're so proud of you, honey," my mother had said, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. But even as she spoke, her eyes kept drifting to Clara, who was regaling our waiter with some story about her weekend adventures. Clara was a sophomore then, all wild curly hair and infectious laughter, the kind of girl who could light up a room just by walking into it. "Nora's always been our little scholar," my father had added, but there was something in his tone, a subtle implication that academic success was expected from me, unremarkable even. Clara's got different gifts. People just gravitate toward her, you know? And they did. God, they did. Even that night, celebrating my achievement, the waiter lingered at our table longer than necessary, charmed by Clara's stories about the drama club and her plans for homecoming. My valedictorian speech, which I'd spent weeks perfecting, became background noise to Clara's impromptu performance. That's when Ethan Ross appeared at our table. Ethan, with his dark hair and green eyes, the boy I'd been secretly in love with since freshman year. We'd been study partners in AP history, and I'd convinced myself that our late-night conversations about the Civil War and our shared love of obscure historical documentaries meant something. "Hey, Nora," he'd said, but his eyes were already finding Clara. "Congratulations on valedictorian. That's amazing." Clara looked up from her conversation with her waiter, and I watched it happen in slow motion. The way her face lit up with interest, the way she tilted her head and smiled that devastating smile that had been breaking hearts since middle school. "You must be Ethan," she'd said, extending her hand. "Nora's mentioned you. She said you're brilliant." That was Clara's gift. She could make anyone feel like the most important person in the room, even while she was stealing them away from you. Within 10 minutes, Ethan had forgotten I existed. He was completely entranced by Clara's stories about her latest community theater audition, laughing at her impressions of the director, hanging on every word. I excused myself to go to the bathroom and spent 5 minutes staring at my reflection in the mirror, trying to understand why I could excel in every academic arena, but still feel invisible next to my younger sister. When I returned to the table, Ethan was writing his number on a napkin and sliding it across to Clara. They dated for the rest of high school. I watched from the sidelines as Clara effortlessly claimed the boy I dreamed about, just like she'd claimed everything else that mattered to me. The worst part wasn't losing Ethan, it was watching my parents beam with pride as Clara brought home her charming boyfriend as if her romantic success was somehow more impressive than my academic achievements. Earth to Nora, Marcus said, snapping me back to the present. What's wrong? I forced a smile and picked up my coffee. Nothing, just processing.
But Marcus knew me too well. This is about your family, isn't it? Let me guess, your parents called to congratulate you, but somehow the conversation ended up being about Clara. He wasn't wrong. My mother had called 20 minutes after the partners' meeting, her voice bright with pride. Oh, sweetheart, we're so thrilled for you. Senior partner, can you imagine? Your father and I always knew your hard work would pay off. It should have been enough. It should have been the validation I'd craved for years. But then she'd continued. You know, Clara's been telling everyone about your promotion. She's so proud of her big sister. She said she always knew you'd make it because you're so dedicated, so focused. Not everyone has that kind of discipline, you know? Clara's got other strengths. She's so natural with people, so charismatic. It's wonderful how different you girls are. Different. That's how my mother had always described us, as if our differences were complementary rather than competitive. But I knew better. Different meant that Clara was the sun, and I was the moon. Useful, reliable, but only really noticed when she wasn't shining. My parents mean well, I told Marcus, though even I could hear the doubt in my voice. They're proud of me. But even when they're celebrating my success, it's always in comparison to Clara. Like they have to explain why my achievements matter because they're not as naturally appealing as hers. Marcus leaned against my desk, his expression serious. Nora, you just became the youngest senior partner in the history of one of Chicago's top architectural firms. You designed the sustainable housing project that's going to house 300 families. You've won awards, you've been featured in architectural magazines, and you've built a reputation based on talent and integrity. That's not something you achieve by accident or charm. That's real. I knew he was right, intellectually, but emotional wounds don't heal through logic, and the part of me that had spent years feeling invisible in my own family still ached every time Clara's name came up. I know, I said. I'm working on it. Therapy helps. Good, because you deserve to enjoy this moment. You've earned it. 2 weeks later, I was finally starting to settle into my new role when the past came crashing back into my present with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. It was a Monday morning staff meeting, one of those routine gatherings where we discussed new projects, reviewed budgets, and went over potential hires. Richard Morrison shuffled through his papers with the methodical precision of a man who'd been running meetings for 30 years. He announced, "We have several promising candidates for the senior PR position. The Hartley account is expanding, and we need someone who can handle high-profile clients and media relations." I was only half listening, my mind focused on the blueprints spread across my tablet when he read the first name. Clara Adams. She's got 5 years of experience at Mitchell Communications, impressive client testimonials, and she comes highly recommended. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. Clara Adams. In a city of 3 million people, what were the odds? But I knew with sickening certainty that this wasn't coincidence. This was my sister, somehow inserting herself into the one space where I had found success and peace. Marcus, sitting beside me, noticed my reaction immediately. His hand found my arm under the table, a gentle reminder to breathe, to stay professional, to not let my personal history show on my face. He continued. Her portfolio includes campaigns for several major nonprofit organizations, and she has a particular strength in crisis management and brand rehabilitation. Of course she did. Clara had always been gifted at spinning narratives, at making disasters look like opportunities. It was a talent she'd perfected in high school, talking her way out of missed assignments and failed tests with stories so compelling that teachers would apologize for doubting her. "When is her interview scheduled?" I managed to ask, proud of how steady my voice sounded. "Thursday at 2. Richard replied, "Nora, since you'll be working closely with the PR department on the Hartley project, I'd like you to sit in on the interviews." The irony was almost funny. After years of avoiding family gatherings and limiting my contact with Clara to the occasional birthday text and obligatory holiday call, fate was forcing us into the same professional space. And not just the same space, I would be evaluating her, sitting across a conference table with the power to influence her future. After the meeting, Marcus followed me back to my office and closed the door behind him. "Okay," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Spill it. What was that about?" "Clara Adams is my sister," I said. Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "Your sister? The one you've mentioned? The one who stole my high school boyfriend and has been the golden child of my family for the past 27 years? Yes, that one."
Jesus, Nora. Marcus ran his hands through his hair. "What are the odds?" "In retrospect, not that surprising," I said, feeling the familiar weight of resignation settle over me. Clara's always been drawn to success, to being associated with prestigious organizations. Morrison Associates has been getting a lot of press lately with the Millennium Tower project and the Sustainability Awards. She probably saw the opening and thought it would be perfect for her image. "Are you going to recuse yourself from the interview process?" The question hung in the air between us. It would be the professional thing to do, the ethical choice. But another part of me, the part that had spent years being overlooked and undervalued, whispered that maybe this was finally my chance to be in the position of power. "I don't know," I admitted. "I should. But part of me wants to see this through. I need to know if she's actually qualified or if she's just relying on charm and connections like she always has." "That's dangerous thinking," Marcus warned. "If you go into that interview with preconceived notions about her abilities, you're not being fair to her or to the firm." He was right, of course, but fairness was a luxury I'd never been afforded in my relationship with Clara. When had she ever considered what was fair to me? I spent the next 3 days trying to prepare myself for Thursday's interview. I researched Clara's work at Mitchell Communications, looked up the campaigns she'd mentioned in her cover letter, and tried to approach the situation with professional objectivity. But every time I thought I'd achieved some measure of emotional distance, a memory would surface. Like the time in college when I'd been dating David, a sweet pre-med student I'd met in organic chemistry. Clara had come to visit during her spring break, and within one weekend, she'd convinced David that she was more fun than I was, more spontaneous. She'd kissed him at a party while I was in the bathroom, and when I confronted her later, she'd said, "If he really loved you, I wouldn't have been able to steal him away. I actually did you a favor." Or the time I'd applied for a summer internship at a prestigious marketing firm, only to find out later that Clara had called the hiring manager and suggested that I might not be people-oriented enough for the role, but that she might be interested in interviewing herself. The pattern was always the same. Clara saw something I wanted or had, decided she wanted it too, and used her natural charisma to take it from me. The worst part was how she made it seem effortless, inevitable, like she wasn't really trying to hurt me. She was just being herself, and if I got hurt in the process, well, that was unfortunate, but not really her fault. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that usually energized me. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy suit that projected authority without seeming intimidating. I wanted to look professional, competent, like the senior partner I now was, rather than the insecure older sister I'd always felt like around Clara. At 1:45, I was sitting in the conference room reviewing Clara's resume one more time when Richard entered with 2 other partners and a woman I didn't know. "Nora, this is Janet Hill from our HR department.
She'll be observing today to ensure we're following all our standard protocols. I nodded and shook Janet's hand, grateful for the external oversight. It would help keep me honest, force me to focus on Clara's qualifications rather than our history. At exactly 2 o'clock, our receptionist knocked on the conference room door. "Miss Adams is here," she announced. "Send her in," Richard said. And then, after 13 years of carefully orchestrated distance, Clara walked back into my life. She hadn't changed much. Clara was still petite and perfectly put together, her dark hair now styled in a sophisticated bob that framed her face beautifully. She wore a cream-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and her smile was as radiant as ever. But there was something different about her now, a polish that hadn't been there in high school. Like she'd taken her natural charisma and refined it into a professional weapon. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice warm and confident as she entered the room. "Thank you so much for this opportunity." She moved around the table, shaking hands with each of the partners, making eye contact, saying their names as they were introduced to her. When she reached me, her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. "Nora," she said, and I heard surprise in her voice, though she recovered quickly. "What a wonderful surprise! I had no idea you worked here." Liar, I thought, but I kept my expression neutral and professional. "Hello, Clara. Please, have a seat." She settled into the chair across from me with the kind of graceful composure that had always made me feel clunky and awkward in comparison. But I reminded myself that I wasn't 17 anymore, and this wasn't high school. I was a senior partner at a prestigious firm, and she was just another job candidate. "Before we begin," Richard said, "I should mention that we were impressed by your portfolio and references. Mitchell Communications speaks very highly of your work."
Clara's smile brightened. I loved my time there. Working with nonprofits taught me so much about storytelling and crisis management. There's nothing like representing an organization that's trying to make a real difference in the world. It was a good answer, I had to admit, the kind of response that showed both professional competence and personal values. But I'd heard Clara give impressive performances before, and I'd learned to look beneath the surface. "Tell us about the Riverside Children's Foundation campaign," I said, referencing one of the projects highlighted in her resume. That was a particularly challenging account, given the allegations of financial mismanagement. Clara's composure never wavered. That was actually one of my favorite projects because it taught me so much about the importance of transparency and authentic communication. When the allegations surfaced, my instinct was to help them get ahead of the story rather than wait and respond defensively. She launched into a detailed explanation of her strategy, and I had to admit it sounded impressive. She talked about community outreach, stakeholder meetings, and a comprehensive audit that had ultimately cleared the foundation of any wrongdoing. The key, she concluded, was helping them understand that crisis management isn't about hiding from problems. It's about facing them head-on with honesty and a clear plan for improvement. Richard nodded approvingly. And what was the outcome? Within 6 months, their donation levels had not only recovered, but increased by 30%, Clara said. More importantly, they'd rebuilt trust with their community. The board actually asked me to stay on as a consultant, even after the crisis had passed. It was a compelling story, and Clara told it with the kind of confident detail that suggested she'd lived through every moment of it. But something nagged at me, a familiar feeling I'd learned to trust over the years. "That's impressive," I said. "Can you walk us through your specific role in developing the communication strategy?" For the first time, Clara hesitated. It was subtle, a brief pause, a slight shift in her posture, but I caught it. "Well, I worked very closely with the senior team. It was really a collaborative effort. I provided input on messaging, helped coordinate with local media, and managed the social media response. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Input, coordination, management, all important functions, but not necessarily leadership roles. I made a mental note to follow up on the specifics later. The interview continued for another 45 minutes, with Clara fielding questions about crisis management, client relations, and her vision for the role at Morrison Associates. She was polished, articulate, and had an answer for everything. But as I listened, I began to notice a pattern in her responses. Every success story involved collaboration with a talented team. Every innovative strategy had been developed in partnership with senior leadership. Every difficult client had been managed with extensive support from colleagues. Clara was skilled at taking credit without actually claiming sole responsibility, a technique that made her sound experienced without making specific claims that could be verified. It was masterful, really, and exactly the kind of thing Clara had always excelled at. As the interview wound down, Richard asked if she had any questions for us. "Actually, yes," Clara said, turning to look directly at me. "Nora, I'm curious about the collaborative culture here. At Mitchell, I thrived in environments where different departments worked closely together. How do you see the PR department interfacing with the architectural teams?" It was a smart question, and the way she'd framed it put me in the position of having to speak positively about working with her if she were hired. Clara might have been many things, but she wasn't stupid. Collaboration is essential in our industry. We work best with PR professionals who understand the technical aspects of our work and can translate complex architectural concepts for broader audiences. It requires someone who can ask the right questions and isn't afraid to dig deep into the details. Clara smiled. "I've always believed that the best PR comes from truly understanding what makes a client special. I'd love the chance to learn about your projects and find ways to tell those stories to the world." After Clara left, the room fell quiet. Richard gathered his notes, Janet made some observations about Clara's presentation skills, and the other partners discussed her qualifications in general terms. But I noticed that no one seemed entirely convinced. "She's certainly charismatic," Janet observed. "She has a strong presence and excellent communication skills."
But, Richard prompted, sensing hesitation, "I'm not sure I got a clear sense of her actual contributions to the projects she mentioned," Janet said. "She was very good at describing outcomes, but less specific about her individual role in achieving them." Marcus, who had been observing quietly from the corner of the room, spoke up. "What did you think, Nora? You asked some good follow-up questions." All eyes turned to me, and I felt the weight of professional responsibility settling on my shoulders. This wasn't about my personal history with Clara. This was about making the right choice for the firm. "I think she's talented," I said slowly, "but I'd like to do some additional reference checks. Some of her responses felt carefully constructed. I want to make sure we're getting the full picture." It was a diplomatic way of expressing my concerns, and it seemed to resonate with the others in the room. "That's reasonable," Richard said. "We have 2 more candidates to interview this week anyway. Let's see how they compare." As the meeting broke up and people filed out of the conference room, Marcus lingered behind. "So," he said quietly, "how was it?" "Complicated," I admitted. "She's good at what she does, I'll give her that. But I can't shake the feeling that there's more performance than substance there." "Is that your professional assessment or your personal bias?" It was the question I'd been dreading, and the honest answer was that I wasn't entirely sure anymore. Both, maybe. But even if I take our history out of it, something doesn't feel right about her responses. She was very good at taking credit without being specific about what she actually did. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Well, you said you wanted to do reference checks. That's the right call. Let the facts speak for themselves." But as I walked back to my office that afternoon, I couldn't shake the memory of Clara's confident smile and polished presentation. She'd been impressive, I had to admit. And if I was being completely honest with myself, part of me had hoped she wouldn't be. Because if Clara got this job, it wouldn't just mean working with my sister.
It would mean watching her charm and manipulate her way into another space that had been mine, another arena where she could outshine me with the effortless charisma that had always been her greatest weapon. For the first time since my promotion, I found myself questioning whether professional success would ever be enough to heal the wounds of a lifetime spent in Clara's shadow. The real test was just beginning. I should have known that the universe wasn't finished with me yet. 2 days after Clara's interview, Marcus appeared in my doorway with that particular expression he wore when delivering news he knew I wouldn't want to hear. "Richard wants to see you in the conference room," he said, then added more quietly, "There's someone here he wants you to meet." The someone turned out to be Ethan Ross. 15 years had changed him in ways that made my chest tighten with unexpected recognition. The boyish face I remembered had sharpened into something more distinguished, his dark hair now touched with silver at the temples, his shoulders broader beneath an expertly tailored navy suit. But his eyes were the same warm brown that once looked at me like I was the only person in the world who mattered. "Ethan," he said, standing when I entered the conference room. His voice carried the same gentle timbre that once whispered promises in the hallway outside my calculus classroom. "It's been a long time." "Ethan," I managed to keep my voice steady, professional. "Richard mentioned we'd be working with an external consultant on the Hartwell project, but I didn't realize it was you." Richard beamed between us like a matchmaker who just orchestrated the perfect introduction. "Ethan's firm has the most innovative approach to sustainable waterfront development on the East Coast. When Hartwell specifically requested expertise in eco-friendly luxury construction, his name was at the top of our list." Of course it was. Ethan had always been brilliant, even in high school when I tutored him in calculus, not because he needed help, but because it gave us an excuse to spend time together. He'd gone on to study environmental engineering at MIT, and judging by Richard's enthusiasm, he'd built exactly the kind of career that 17-year-old Ethan had dreamed about during our long conversations about changing the world through better building. "Congratulations on making senior partner," Ethan said, and there was genuine warmth in his voice. "I heard about your work on the Millennium Tower project. Stunning design." "Thank you." I felt that familiar flutter of validation that came from recognition of my work, complicated now by the source. "Your firm's reputation precedes yours as well." We spent the next hour discussing the technical aspects of the Hartwell project, and I found myself falling into the easy intellectual rhythm that had once defined our relationship.
Asked thoughtful questions about load-bearing requirements for waterfront construction, environmental impact studies, and community integration strategies. His expertise was genuine and impressive, and despite everything that had happened between us, I couldn't help but respect the professional he'd become. "I should mention," Richard said as our meeting wound down, "we're still finalizing the PR consultant for this project. The team dynamic will be crucial for something this high profile." "Actually," Ethan said, and something in his tone made me look up from my notes. "Nora Adams interviewed earlier this week, didn't she? I saw her name on the candidate list when I was reviewing project materials." The conference room suddenly felt smaller. "You know Nora?" Ethan's eyes met mine, and I saw something flicker there. Guilt, regret, maybe apology? "We've kept in touch over the years. She mentioned she was interviewing here." Of course they had kept in touch, of course Nora had mentioned it, and of course Ethan would put in a good word for her, because that's what Nora did. She cultivated relationships and called in favors with the same natural ease that other people breathed. "Nora's incredibly talented," Ethan continued, addressing Richard but clearly aware of my scrutiny. "Her work with lifestyle brands would translate beautifully to luxury residential development. Plus, she understands the Chicago market." "That's exactly what we need," Richard agreed enthusiastically. "Nora, you interviewed her. What were your impressions?" I felt trapped between honesty and professionalism, between my personal history with both Nora and Ethan, and my responsibility to the firm. "She's certainly charismatic," I said carefully, "though I do have some concerns about her specific experience with architectural marketing." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "I could help bridge that gap," Clara's a quick study, and with the right guidance on the technical aspects, her natural communication skills would be invaluable. Natural communication skills. The same phrase teachers had used about Clara when she'd charmed her way through presentations she hadn't prepared for, while I had earned praise for thoroughness and attention to detail. Now Ethan was offering to be her technical guide, just as I'd once been her academic one. "I'll certainly take that recommendation into consideration," Richard said. "Ethan, we're thrilled to have you on board. Nora will be your primary point of contact as the project moves forward." After Richard left, Ethan and I found ourselves alone in the conference room. The silence stretched between us, filled with 15 years of unspoken words and unresolved history. "Nora," he said finally, "I owe you an apology. For high school. For the way things ended. I was 18 and stupid, and I hurt you badly." I studied his face, looking for signs of the boy who had once held my hand during lunch periods and promised to take me to junior prom. "It was a long time ago, Ethan. We were kids. That doesn't make it right." He ran his hair through his hair, a gesture I remembered when he was nervous about calculus exams. "I know this is probably awkward, working together, especially with Clara applying for the same project." "Why did you recommend her?" The question came out sharper than I intended. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "Because she asked me to," he said honestly. "And because I thought she'd deserve a chance to prove herself. But also," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "because I hoped it might give us all a chance to put the past behind us, to work together as adults rather than carrying around all this high school baggage." High school baggage, as if Clara stealing the boy I'd been in love with was just adolescent drama rather than the defining moment that had taught me to guard my heart and my achievements with equal ferocity. "We're adults now," I agreed, "and as adults, we should focus on what's best for the project and the firm." Ethan nodded, but something in his expression suggested he heard the warning beneath my words. Clara might have asked for his recommendation, but I was the senior partner now. I was the one who would make the final decision about whether she got this job. As I watched him gather his materials and head toward the elevator, I caught a glimpse of movement in the lobby. Clara stood near the reception desk, her blonde hair catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She was facing away from me, but something about her posture, the slight tilt of her head, the way she held her phone suggested she'd been watching our meeting through the glass conference room walls. When Ethan emerged from the elevator, Clara turned with that radiant smile I knew so well. Even from a distance, I could see her animated greeting, the way she touched his arm while they talked, the familiar choreography of Clara drawing someone into her orbit. Marcus appeared beside me, following my gaze toward the lobby. "Old friends?" he asked quietly. "Something like that," I replied, watching Clara and Ethan walk toward the building's exit together. "Marcus, I need you to do something for me. I want a complete background check on Clara's work history, not just the references she provided. I want to verify every project, every role, every claim on that resume." Marcus raised an eyebrow, but didn't question my request. "How deep do you want me to dig?" "Deep enough to make sure we know exactly who we're considering hiring." As Clara and Ethan disappeared onto the busy Chicago sidewalk, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't 17 anymore, and I wasn't going to let Clara charm her way into taking something else that mattered to me, not without a fight. Sunday dinner at my parents' house in Winnetka had been a monthly tradition since I'd moved back to Chicago, though tradition might have been too strong a word for something that felt more like a carefully orchestrated performance, where everyone knew their roles, but no one enjoyed the show. The Adams family dining room hadn't changed much since my childhood. The same mahogany table that seated 8, the same crystal chandelier that had presided over countless awkward conversations, the same family portraits lining the walls that documented decades of forced smiles and coordinated outfits. I arrived at 6 sharp, as always, carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than I wanted to spend but less than my parents would notice. Clara's silver BMW was already in the driveway, which meant she'd beaten me there despite the fact that she lived further from Winnetka than I did. Punctuality had never been Clara's strong suit, but she'd apparently made an exception tonight. I found them in the living room. Mom perched on the edge of the velvet sofa with her usual perfect posture, Dad in his leather armchair with the Sunday Tribune folded beside him, and Clara curled up in the window seat like she was posing for a family portrait. The scene was so perfectly arranged, it could have been a magazine spread titled, "Successful Family Enjoys Quality Time." "Nora!" Clara jumped up to hug me, her greeting warm and theatrical. "I was just telling Mom and Dad about my interview at your firm. What a small world, right?" "Small indeed," I replied, accepting her hug and breathing in the expensive perfume that had been her signature since college. "How did you think it went?" Clara's laugh was bright and confident. "Oh, you know me. I think I charmed the pants off everyone." "Well, almost everyone." She gave me a pointed look that was playful on the surface, but carried an undertone I couldn't quite decipher. Mom rose to kiss my cheek, her movements graceful despite her 63 years. "Clara's been telling us about this wonderful opportunity. It sounds like exactly the kind of high-profile project that would showcase her talents." "It's certainly a significant account," I agreed neutrally. Dad stood to clap me on the shoulder, his grip firm and approving in the way it had been since I was 12 and started bringing home straight A's. "Your sister says you're the one making the hiring decision. That must feel good, being in a position to help family." The assumption in his words made my jaw tighten. Help family. As if Clara getting the job would be a favor I was doing, rather than a business decision based on qualifications and merit. "I'm part of the hiring committee. The decision will be made based on what's best for the firm and our client." Clara settled back into the window seat, tucking her legs beneath her in that effortlessly graceful way she'd perfected. "Of course, I wouldn't want any special treatment just because we're sisters. Though I have to say, it's nice to finally be working in the same field. We've both done so well in our respective careers. Maybe now we can support each other professionally, too." Support each other. The phrase rankled because it suggested equality, reciprocity, a mutual exchange of benefits. But our relationship had never been equal. I'd been supporting Clara since we were children, helping with homework, covering for missed curfews, watching from the audience while she performed in school plays I'd helped her practice for. "Tell us about this project," Mom said, settling back into her hostess role. "It sounds glamorous." Clara launched into an animated description of the Hartwell development, painting a picture of luxury condominiums and boutique retail spaces that would transform Chicago's waterfront. She spoke with confident authority as someone who'd already gotten the job, describing our vision and my strategy as if the PR campaign was already underway. "And the best part," Clara continued, her eyes sparkling with excitement, "is that I'll be working with Ethan Ross. You remember Ethan, don't you? From high school?" The room suddenly felt several degrees warmer. Mom's eyebrows raised with interest, while Dad leaned forward in his chair. "Ethan Ross," Mom mused. "Wasn't he the boy you took to junior prom?" "That's right," Clara said smoothly, not looking at me. "He's become quite successful, runs his own environmental engineering firm now. We've stayed in touch over the years, and when he heard I was interviewing for this project, he was thrilled. He thinks we'll make a fantastic team." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Clara was rewriting history with the same casual confidence she'd always used to reshape inconvenient truths. Ethan hadn't taken her to junior prom. He'd taken her to senior prom, after abandoning his plans to take me to junior prom. But the distinction didn't matter to anyone else at this table because they'd never paid attention to the details of my disappointment.
"How wonderful," Mom said, clasping her hands together. "It's so nice when old friendships turn into professional opportunities." "Isn't it?" Clara agreed.
Ethan was just saying how excited he is to work with both of us. Though, between you and me, I think he's particularly looking forward to collaborating with me on the creative aspects of the campaign. The words were casual, but Clara's tone carried a subtle emphasis that suggested deeper meaning. She was letting me know, in the polite, coded language of family dinner conversation, that she still had Ethan's attention and support. "Well, that settles it then," Dad said with satisfaction. "Sounds like you're practically a shoo-in for this position, sweetheart." "Dad," I said, setting down my wineglass with perhaps more force than necessary, "the hiring process involves multiple candidates and several rounds of evaluation. Nothing is settled." The room went quiet. Mom's smile became strained, while Dad frowned in my direction. "Of course, dear," Mom said carefully. "I'm sure Nora is being very thorough and professional about the whole process." "Professional," Clara repeated, and somehow she managed to make the word sound like a gentle criticism. "That's always been Nora's strength, keeping everything very proper and by the book." The dismissive tone in her voice, the subtle suggestion that being professional was somehow limiting rather than admirable, triggered something deep and long suppressed in my chest. "Yes, I am professional," I said, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "That's how I became senior partner at 32. That's how I've built a career based on merit rather than charm and connections." The silence that followed was deafening. Clara's eyes widened with hurt surprise, while Mom made a small sound of dismay. "Nora, honey," Mom said, her voice taking on the soothing tone she'd always used to diffuse family conflicts, "Clara didn't mean anything by—" "Clara never means anything by it. She never means to take center stage at every family gathering. She never means to turn my achievements into footnotes to her stories. She never meant to steal my boyfriend 15 years ago, and she doesn't mean to waltz into my professional life now and expect special treatment." Clara's face went pale, then flushed with anger. "I can't believe you're still holding on to that high school drama. We were kids, Nora. And for the record, nobody stole anything. Ethan made his own choices." "You're right," I said, standing up from the table. "He did make choices, and now I get to make mine." The drive home was a blur of tree-lined streets and traffic lights, my hands gripping the steering wheel while my mind replayed every word of the disastrous dinner. I'd lost control, let 15 years of carefully managed resentment spill out in front of my family like wine on their precious Persian rug. But beneath the embarrassment and regret, I felt something else. Relief. For once, I'd said what I actually thought instead of smiling politely and swallowing my feelings for the sake of family harmony. By the time I reached my downtown condo, I'd made my mind. Clara wanted to compete for this job? Fine, but she was going to have to earn it based on her qualifications, not her ability to manipulate family dynamics and old relationships. The question was, did she actually have the qualifications to earn it? I had a feeling I was about to find out. Marcus arrived at my office Monday morning with a thick folder and the expression of someone who'd spent the weekend uncovering secrets he wished he could forget. "The background check on Nora Adams," he said, setting the folder on my desk with deliberate care. "You're not going to like what I found." I opened the folder and began reading, my coffee growing cold as I absorbed page after page of carefully documented discrepancies. Phone calls to former colleagues who described Clara as more of a supporting team member rather than the project leader her resume suggested. References to campaigns where her actual role was coordinator or assistant, not the strategic position she had claimed. Timeline inconsistencies that revealed months-long gaps in her employment history that her resume had carefully obscured. The Meridian Hotel project, Marcus said, pointing to a particular section. She listed herself as lead strategist, but according to 3 people I spoke to, she was brought in as a junior coordinator halfway through the campaign. The actual lead strategist left the company 6 months before Clara arrived. I studied the documentation, feeling my professional instincts war with something darker and more personal. This is extensive, I said finally. How bad is it? Bad enough that any other candidate would be automatically disqualified. But Nora, you need to be careful how you handle this. If Clara finds out you had her investigated specifically, it could look like a personal vendetta. He was right, of course, but as I read through the evidence of Clara's inflated resume, I felt a familiar sense of vindication mixed with disappointment. Once again, Clara had chosen the easy path over the honest one. The second round of interviews was scheduled for Wednesday. Richard had narrowed the field to 3 candidates: Clara, a veteran PR executive from LA, and a rising star from a boutique Chicago firm. The format would be different this time. Each candidate would present a preliminary strategy for the Hartwell campaign to the full project team, including Ethan. I spent Tuesday evening preparing questions that would test each candidate's specific knowledge and strategic thinking. Professional questions, focused entirely on qualifications and approach. If Clara couldn't answer them adequately, it would be her own shortcomings that eliminated her from consideration, not any personal bias on my part. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made Chicago feel like the center of the universe. Clara arrived 15 minutes early, looking polished and confident in a burgundy dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She'd brought visual aids, a leather portfolio, and that radiant smile that had been opening doors for her since elementary school. The presentation began smoothly. Clara spoke eloquently about brand positioning, target demographics, and market penetration strategies. Her slides were beautifully designed, her speaking style engaging and persuasive. For the first 10 minutes, I almost forgot about the folder of discrepancies locked in my desk drawer. Then I began asking questions. Walk us through your approach to timeline management. The Hartwell project has strict construction deadlines that will affect PR rollout strategies. Clara nodded confidently. Absolutely. In my experience managing the Meridian Hotel launch, we had similar constraints. The key is building flexibility into your strategy while maintaining consistent messaging across all phases. Tell us about that flexibility. What specific challenges did you encounter during the Meridian project, and how did you adapt your original timeline? Clara's hesitation was barely perceptible, but I caught it. Well, there were the usual challenges like permit delays, contractor issues, that sort of thing. The important thing is maintaining open communication with all stakeholders. It was a generic answer, the kind of response someone might give if they'd read about a project rather than actually managed it. I glanced at Marcus, who was taking notes with studied neutrality, then at Ethan, who was watching Clara with a slight frown. Can you give us a specific example, a particular challenge, and the specific adaptation you made to address it? This time, the hesitation was longer. Clara's smile faltered for a moment before brightening again. You know, there were so many moving parts on that project, I'd hate to misremember the details and give you inaccurate information. Richard nodded approvingly. That's professional of you to acknowledge your limits. But Ethan leaned forward slightly. Clara, didn't you mention yesterday that the Meridian project was your biggest success? I'd think you'd remember the major challenges pretty clearly. Yesterday. They'd spoken yesterday. I filed that information away while watching Clara navigate the increasingly uncomfortable questions. Of course I remember, she said, her laugh just a little too bright. I just want to make sure I'm giving you the most accurate timeline information possible. Perhaps I could follow up with detailed project documentation. Documentation that would be difficult to provide if she hadn't actually led the project. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, with Clara's answers becoming increasingly vague when pressed for specifics. She recovered her composure discussing general marketing principles, but stumbled when asked about concrete examples from her supposed experience. After Clara left, we interviewed the other two candidates. Both were knowledgeable, experienced, and able to provide specific examples and detailed explanations of their strategic approaches. The contrast was striking. Interesting, Richard said, after the final interview concluded. The Adams candidate certainly has presence, but I found her answers somewhat lacking in substance. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. I think Clara might be better suited to a...
It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging what we'd all observed. Clara was charming and articulate, but she didn't have the depth of experience necessary for a project of this complexity and importance. That evening, as I sat in my office reviewing notes from the interviews, Marcus knocked on my door. "The decision seems pretty clear," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Does it?" Come on, Nora. Based purely on merit, Clara Adams shouldn't even be in the final running. Her presentation was all surface, no substance. She couldn't answer basic strategic questions about projects she claimed to have led. Marcus was right, but something in his tone suggested there was more he wanted to say. "What aren't you telling me?" Marcus sighed. "I ran into Tessa Reeves in the lobby after the interviews. Clara's friend? She made some interesting comments about how family dynamics might be affecting your judgment." My blood chilled. "What kind of comments?" "She suggested that maybe you were being harder on Clara than the other candidates because of personal issues. Said something about how unfortunate it would be if professional jealousy prevented a qualified candidate from getting a fair chance." The implication was clear. Clara was already positioning herself as the victim of my personal bias, preparing a narrative that would make me look petty and vindictive if I didn't recommend her for the position. "Marcus," I said slowly, "based purely on the interviews and qualifications, who would you recommend for this position?" "The LA candidate, without question. She has the experience, the strategic thinking, and the portfolio to back it up." "Then that's what I'll recommend to Richard." Marcus nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Just be prepared for Clara to not take this well. And Nora, document everything. Make sure your reasoning is bulletproof and completely professional." As he left my office, I stared out at the Chicago skyline and wondered when protecting my professional integrity had become so complicated. I'd built my career on merit, on doing excellent work and making sound decisions based on facts and qualifications. Clara had always been able to charm her way through situations where I'd had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. But this time, in my domain, with my rules, charm wouldn't be enough. The question was, would Clara accept defeat gracefully, or was this just the beginning of a war I wasn't prepared to fight? The final presentation was scheduled for Friday morning in our largest conference room with the full project team, Richard, and 2 additional partners in attendance. It was meant to be Clara's last chance to prove she belonged on the Hartwell account, but I suspected it would actually be her undoing. Clara arrived looking like she'd stepped out of a business magazine, a charcoal ray power suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, her blonde hair swept into a sophisticated chignon, every detail calculated to project competence and authority. But I'd learned to look beyond Clara's carefully constructed surface, and today I could see the tension in the set of her shoulders, the slight tightness around her eyes that suggested she knew she was walking into hostile territory. Tessa had come again, settling into a chair near the back of the room like a protective guardian. Her presence still puzzled me. What legitimate reason could there be for a former colleague to attend multiple rounds of interviews unless she was there to provide support Clara knew she'd need? "Thank you all for being here," Richard began. "As you know, the Hartwell account represents one of our most significant projects this year. We need someone who can navigate the complexities of luxury residential marketing while working seamlessly with our architectural team and external consultants." Clara stood with practiced confidence, activating her presentation slides with a smooth gesture.
Her opening was polished, hitting all the right notes about brand synergy and market positioning. But I was no longer listening to her words. I was watching for the moments when her confidence would crack. Tell us about your experience with community stakeholder management, I interrupted, consulting the list of questions I'd prepared. The Hartwell project will face significant community opposition due to its waterfront location and luxury pricing. How would you handle that? Clara smiled brightly. Excellent question. In my work with the Harbor Bay development in Boston, we faced similar challenges with community pushback.
Harbor Bay. I'd never seen that project mentioned in her portfolio or resume, but Clara delivered the details with such conviction that I almost believed she was drawing from real experience. What specific strategies did you implement to address community concerns? I pressed. We organized listening sessions with local residents, partnered with community organizations, and made sure our messaging emphasized the economic benefits for the neighborhood: job creation, increased property values, that sort of thing. It sounded reasonable, even thoughtful, but something about Clara's delivery felt rehearsed, like she was reciting talking points rather than describing lived experience. Ethan leaned forward from his position at the opposite end of the table. Clara, I'm familiar with the Harbor Bay project. Wasn't that primarily handled by Morrison Associates? I thought they brought in a specialist firm for community relations. The color drained from Clara's face so quickly I thought she might faint. For a moment, the polished professional facade cracked completely, revealing the panic underneath. Well, she said, her voice slightly higher than usual, Morrison was the lead firm, but we collaborated extensively on strategy development. Interesting, Ethan said mildly, because I worked on the environmental impact assessment for Harbor Bay, and I don't recall your firm being involved in the stakeholder management process. Tessa suddenly spoke up from the position at the back of the room. Clara was instrumental in developing the communication framework that Morrison implemented. Her strategic vision shaped the entire approach, even if she wasn't the firm of record. The room went silent. It was one thing for a candidate to embellish their experience. It was another for their supposed reference to actively participate in reshaping the narrative during an interview. Richard frowned. I'm sorry, Ms. Reeves, but we need to hear from the candidate herself about her direct experience. Clara's recovery was impressive, I had to admit. She straightened her shoulders and smiled with renewed confidence. Of course, I should clarify, my role was more consultative, working behind the scenes to develop strategies that other firms implemented. I prefer to let my work speak for itself rather than taking credit for collaborative efforts. It was a clever pivot, making her lack of direct responsibility sound like professional humility rather than outright deception. But I could see that Ethan wasn't buying it, and neither were the other partners in the room. Let's talk about budget management, I continued, consulting my notes. The Hartwell account has a 7-figure marketing budget across multiple phases. Walk us through your approach to resource allocation and ROI measurement. This time, Clara's answer was more obviously generic. She spoke about percentage allocations and measurement metrics with the fluency of someone who'd studied marketing textbooks but lacked the practical experience of actually managing large budgets. When I asked for specific examples of how she'd adjusted campaign spending based on performance data, her response became increasingly vague and filled with industry jargon that sounded impressive but said nothing. I notice you haven't mentioned any specific campaigns where you had full budget authority, I observed. Clara's smile faltered. Well, budget management is typically a collaborative process. I work closely with financial teams to ensure optimal allocation. But you've never had direct responsibility for a 7-figure campaign budget? The pause stretched too long. I've had oversight of significant portions of larger budgets, she said finally. It wasn't an answer, and everyone in the room knew it. The presentation limped to its conclusion, with Clara's confidence visibly eroding under continued questioning. By the time she delivered her closing remarks, the polished professional had been replaced by someone who looked like she was fighting to keep her composure. After Clara and Tessa left, the room buzzed with quiet conversations. The consensus was clear. Clara Adams lacked the experience and expertise necessary for the Hartwell account. Well, Richard said with obvious disappointment. That was illuminating. I should have known Clara wouldn't go down without a fight. Monday morning brought a series of uncomfortable conversations that made it clear Clara had spent her weekend deploying every weapon in her considerable arsenal. It started with a call from my mother. "Nora, darling, I'm concerned about you," Mom said, her voice carrying that particular tone of maternal worry that had always made me feel like a disappointment. "Clara came by yesterday and she was quite upset about how she's being treated at your firm." "Mom, I can't discuss personnel matters."
She says you're letting old grudges affect your professional judgment, that you're punishing her for something that happened in high school. Mom's voice grew sharper. I raised you better than that, Nora. Family should support family, not tear each other down out of jealousy. Jealousy. Clara had played that card perfectly, knowing exactly which buttons to push with our parents. The day only got worse from there. Marcus intercepted me before I reached my office with news that rumors were circulating about my personal vendetta against a qualified candidate. Apparently, Clara had reached out to several people in Chicago's marketing community, painting herself as the victim of workplace bias. She's being smart about it, Marcus warned, not making direct accusations, just expressing disappointment about how family dynamics can complicate professional relationships. She's positioning herself as the mature one who's trying to rise above petty conflicts. By Wednesday, the Whisper campaign had reached our office. I caught fragments of conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached, saw the sympathetic looks from colleagues who clearly believed Clara's version of events. The breaking point came Thursday afternoon, when Richard called me into his office. "Nora, I've received some troubling communications regarding the Hartwell hiring process," he said, his expression more serious than I'd seen since the day he'd promoted me to senior partner. My heart sank. "What kind of communications?" "Questions about whether personal relationships might be affecting our evaluation process. Concerns that we might be exposing the firm to potential discrimination claims." "Richard, I can assure you that my evaluation of all candidates has been based solely on professional qualifications." He held up a hand to stop me. "I believe that, Nora, but perception matters. I need you to provide me with detailed documentation of your decision-making process. Every question asked, every qualification assessed, every recommendation made. If we're going to reject Clara Adams, I need ironclad, professional justification." That evening, I worked late compiling the evidence that would protect both me and the firm. Marcus stayed to help, organizing interview notes, candidate comparisons, and the damning background check that revealed the extent of Clara's resume fabrications. "She's good," Marcus admitted, as we reviewed Clara's strategic campaign against my reputation. "Evil but good. She's managed to make herself look like the victim while putting you on the defensive." "The truth has to count for something," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it anymore. "The truth is that Clara Adams is unqualified for this position," Marcus replied firmly. "The truth is that you've conducted a thorough professional evaluation process. The truth is that she's trying to manipulate her way into a job she can't actually do." As if summoned by our conversation, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Still time to do the right thing for family. Some bridges shouldn't be burned. C." I showed the message to Marcus, who shook his head in disgust. "She's threatening you." "She's trying to," I corrected, "but she's not 17 anymore, and this isn't high school. She can't charm or manipulate her way out of being genuinely unqualified." Friday morning brought unexpected support from an unlikely source. Ethan appeared at my office door, looking troubled. "Nora, I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "Clara asked me to recommend her for this position, and I did it without really thinking about whether she was actually qualified. I was trying to be a good friend, but I may have done both of you a disservice." I gestured for him to sit down. "What changed her mind?" "He spent some time this week reviewing her actual experience versus what she claimed during the interviews. The discrepancies are significant." He ran a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture. "Harbor Bay was the final straw. She described community engagement strategies that never happened for a project I worked on extensively. She wasn't just embellishing, she was making things up entirely." The vindication felt sweet, but I kept my voice neutral. "What do you want to do about it?" "I want to withdraw my recommendation," Ethan said firmly, "and I want to make it clear to Richard that my initial support was based on incomplete information about her qualifications." As Ethan left my office, I felt something shift in the balance of power. Clara's carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble, and this time, I wasn't the only one who could see through her facade. The final hiring meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Richard had assembled the full evaluation committee, the 2 additional partners, our head of client relations, and me. Ethan would join us to provide his assessment of each candidate's fit for the technical requirements of the project.
I arrived early, my portfolio containing 6 months of meticulous documentation, interview transcripts, background verification reports, detailed candidate comparisons, and Ethan's formal withdrawal of his recommendation for Clara. Everything organized, professional, indisputable. Clara entered the conference room like she owned it, her confidence fully restored after what I could only assume had been a weekend of regrouping and strategizing. She wore a navy blue dress that projected authority, her smile bright and determined. "Good morning, everyone," she said warmly, as if she were already part of the team, rather than a candidate whose qualifications were about to be dissected. Richard opened the meeting with a review of the evaluation process and criteria. "We've conducted extensive interviews, reviewed portfolios, and checked references for all candidates. Nora, as project lead, would you present your recommendations?" This was it, the moment when I either let Clara charm her way into another unearned opportunity or stood up for the principle that competence should matter more than connections. "Thank you, Richard," I began, opening my portfolio. "Based on our comprehensive evaluation process, I recommend Janet Morrison from Los Angeles for the Hartwell account." Clara's smile flickered but didn't disappear entirely. "Janet brings 15 years of luxury residential marketing experience, including successful launches of 3 major waterfront developments. She has direct experience managing 7-figure budgets and demonstrated expertise in community stakeholder management." I clicked to the next slide, which compared all 3 finalists across key criteria. Clara's column was noticeably sparse in concrete accomplishments. "I have concerns about Ms. Adams' suitability for this specific role," I continued, my voice steady and professional. "During our interview process, significant discrepancies emerged between her stated experience and verifiable accomplishments." "What kind of discrepancies?" Richard asked, though his expression suggested he already suspected what was coming. I opened the folder containing Clara's background check. Ms. Adams listed herself as lead strategist for the Meridian Hotel campaign. However, according to 3 former colleagues at her previous firm, she joined that project as a junior coordinator halfway through the campaign timeline. The actual lead strategist left the company 6 months before Ms. Adams was hired. Clara's face went pale, but she straightened in her chair. "There seems to be some confusion about collaborative roles and individual contributions." "Additionally," I continued, consulting my notes, "Ms. Adams described detailed community engagement strategies for the Harbor Bay development in Boston. Mr. Ross, who worked on that project's environmental impact assessment, confirmed that Ms. Adams' firm had no involvement in community relations management for that development." Ethan nodded grimly from his position at the table. "That's correct. I worked extensively with the actual community relations team, and I can confirm that Ms. Adams' descriptions of her involvement were inaccurate." Clara shot to her feet, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "This is unbelievable," she snapped, her voice rising. "Nora, you've been gunning for me since the moment you saw my application. You can't stand that I might actually succeed in your precious professional world." The room fell silent, Richard's eyebrows raised in shock at Clara's outburst, while the other partners exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Clara," I said quietly, "this evaluation is based solely on professional qualifications and verifiable experience." "Bullshit!" Clara's voice carried across the conference room, all pretense of professionalism abandoned. "This is about Ethan, isn't it? About high school. You can't let go of the fact that he chose me over you, so now you're sabotaging my career out of spite." "Clara, please," Ethan said, looking mortified. "This isn't about—" "Don't defend her, Ethan. She's been jealous of me our entire lives, and now she finally has the power to hurt me professionally, so she's taking it." Richard stood up slowly, his face grave. "Miss Adams, I think this meeting is over." "You're damn right it's over," Clara snarled, grabbing her purse and portfolio. "But don't think this ends here, Nora. You want to play hardball with family? Fine. But remember, I know things about you that you wouldn't want your precious clients to hear." The door slammed behind her, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. Richard was the first to speak. "Well," he said dryly, "I think that settles any questions about Ms. Adams' suitability for client-facing work." As the meeting concluded and the others filed out, Ethan lingered behind. "Nora, I'm sorry. I had no idea she would react like that." "I did," I replied, though Clara's public meltdown had been even more spectacular than I had anticipated. Clara's never handled rejection well. The difference is that this time, she couldn't charm her way out of the consequences. For 15 years, I'd watched Clara manipulate situations to her advantage, using charm and family loyalty to escape accountability for her actions. But finally, in the professional world I'd built through discipline and merit, her tactics had backfired. The question now was whether Clara would accept defeat or escalate her threats into something more dangerous. Knowing my sister, I suspected I was about to find out exactly how far she was willing to go to avoid facing the truth about herself. The silence stretched like a held breath. Jake's eyes darted between Melissa and me, realization dawning across his features. "You never mentioned having a sister in marketing," he said slowly, his voice tight with confusion. Melissa's face had gone pale, her perfectly glossed lips parting wordlessly. My mother's fork clinked against her plate as understanding crashed over the table like a wave. "Olivia," my father began, but I was already standing, my napkin falling to the floor. 3 years, Jake. 3 years you've been dating my sister, and she never once mentioned that her difficult sister was your boss. The birthday dinner dissolved into chaos, but for the first time in decades, I wasn't the one causing it.